There is a grief that arrives without a funeral, because nothing officially ended. The job may still be there, the relationship may still be intact, the city may still look the same, and yet something in you has crossed a line that does not allow return. You wake up and feel it like distance, not from life, but from the version of you that used to fit inside it. You keep reaching for the old baseline, the old ease, the old ability to pretend that certain things did not matter. The reaching fails and the failure hurts because it proves that the door is real. This grief confuses people because it does not always attach to a single event. It attaches to a whole atmosphere you used to live in, a mental weather you could rely on, even when it was not healthy. You might call it innocence, but it is rarely innocence. It is often numbness with a softer name. You might call it simplicity, but it is often suppression dressed as peace. The grief is the cost of seeing clearly, because clear seeing changes your relationship to your own history. An unspoken objection rises here, asking why awareness would steal what once helped you survive. And the answer does not soothe, because survival tools become cages when the emergency ends. You do not grieve only what happened, you grieve what you believed was happening. You grieve the meaning you assigned to sacrifices, the narrative you used to justify endurance, the promises you made to yourself that were never truly yours. The mind tries to defend the past, because defending the past protects the identity built from it. But the body remembers the price, and the body does not negotiate with nostalgia. When grief arrives, it is the body insisting on truth that the mind used to edit. And once the edit breaks, the old story cannot hold. Some of this grief is not about losing people, but about losing the version of you that could keep people. You realize how much of your stability was purchased through shrinking, smoothing, adapting, anticipating, and staying easy to handle. You might still be kind, but kindness stops meaning self-erasure. And that shift changes everything. The old relational habits no longer feel neutral. They feel costly, because you can feel yourself leaving your own center each time you perform them. An unspoken objection appears, asking if this means you will become harder to love. And the partial answer is that you may become harder to use, which is not the same thing, though it will be treated as the same by those who benefited. Grief for the life you cannot go back to is also grief for how you used to interpret pain. Before awakening deepened, pain could be turned into a lesson quickly. A quote, a silver lining, a reason, how pain resists being converted into meaning on demand, because meaning without contact becomes another bypass. You try to wrap the ache in purpose and it slips out. Like something refusing packaging, that refusal feels like emptiness. And emptiness scares the mind because it cannot be controlled through explanation. But emptiness is sometimes the first honest space you have had in years. You may notice that this grief comes in waves, often during ordinary moments. A song, a smell, a familiar street, an old photograph, and suddenly you feel the absence of the old self like a physical ache. People around you may assume you are sentimental, but you are not only remembering, you are recognizing. You recognize that the person who lived those moments did not have your current awareness, and therefore lived inside a different world. The world looks similar now, yet your inner permissions have changed, and that is why the memory hurts. An unspoken objection rises, asking whether you are becoming trapped by the past, and the partial answer is that you are finally seeing the past without anesthesia, which feels like captivity until it becomes integration. This grief intensifies when you realize that going back would not actually fix anything. The mind fantasies about return because return promises relief, yet return would require you to become less honest than you are now. The grief is sharpened by that realization, because it removes the comfort of escape routes. You cannot unsee what you have seen, and you cannot unfeel what your nervous system has started reporting. The life you cannot go back to is not only a set of circumstances, it is a level of internal disconnection you no longer tolerate. That intolerance is not virtue, it is a threshold shift. And threshold shifts have consequences. One consequence is that your old coping mechanisms start failing. Distraction works for shorter periods. Overwork feels heavier. Social performance drains faster. Spiritual reassurance sounds thin. The mind calls this instability, but it is often a system refusing further self-deception. You may attempt to tighten discipline to regain control, yet control becomes less effective because the inner conflict it covered is now visible. The grief is partly the discomfort of losing your old exits. An unspoken objection arises, asking if life is now supposed to be constant confrontation. And the partial answer is that confrontation is not the goal, but avoidance is no longer an option without immediate cost. This is why grief often carries anger underneath it. Not always loud anger, but a dense anger directed at time, at systems, at people, at yourself. You may feel betrayed by how much you gave, and by how little was returned. Yet the deeper betrayal is how long you agreed to it. That realization is sharp because it threatens the identity of the good person, the loyal one, the strong one, the forgiving one. But identity built on self-abandonment cannot be kept once self-contact returns. The grief is the tearing sound of that identity losing its authority. Another layer of grief is the collapse of imagined timelines. You grieve the future you assumed would happen if you did everything right. You grieve the reward you expected from patience, the relationship you expected to deepen, the recognition you expected to arrive, the peace you expected to earn. Awakening exposes how many of those expectations were deals made with fear. Fear said if you endure long enough, you will be saved. If you perform well enough, you will be chosen. If you fix yourself enough, you will be safe. When those deals collapse, the future feels blank. An unspoken objection appears, asking whether blank means hopeless. And the partial answer is that blank means undetermined, which is terrifying for a mind trained to equate certainty with safety. Grief also changes how you experience other people. You can still love them, but you notice where they are asleep, and you notice where you used to be asleep with them. You may feel distance not because you are superior, but because your inner reference point has moved. Conversations that once felt normal now feel like choreography. Certain jokes feel like avoidance. Certain advice feels like denial. This can make you lonely even in company, because loneliness is not only about being alone, it is about being unseen in your new reality. And being unseen after becoming more honest feels sharper than being unseen when you were still hiding. This loneliness creates a temptation to shrink back. You think about softening your truths, returning to agreeable versions of yourself, blending again. The mind argues that it is practical, that you cannot live as an exposed nerve. Yet the body refuses because the cost is now immediate, and immediate costs cannot be rationalized away easily. You may try anyway, and the grief will intensify not as punishment, but as feedback. An unspoken objection rises, asking if you are being unreasonable for wanting more alignment than others around you want. And the partial answer is that you are not asking them to change. You are being asked to change back, which is a different demand. You might also notice that grief is teaching you what you actually valued. People think grief proves attachment, but grief often reveals meaning. You grieve the moments where you felt real, even if they were rare. You grieve the places where you felt safe, even if the safety was temporary. You grieve the identity of being able to hope without calculation. These losses matter because they show what your system recognizes as nourishment. Yet nourishment that was once accidental must now be built intentionally. And intention requires responsibility. Responsibility is heavy at first because it removes the comfort of chance. This is where the nervous system enters the foreground again. Grief is not only emotion, it is physiology reorganizing around a new truth. Your body has stored years of compromises as tension patterns, and grief loosens those patterns unevenly. Some days you feel clear, other days you feel crushed, and the inconsistency makes you doubt the process. The mind wants linear progress, but the body releases in spirals, returning to themes until the charge is fully metabolized. An unspoken objection appears, asking why you keep revisiting what you thought you already healed. And the partial answer is that healing was incomplete because your capacity at that time was smaller, and capacity has expanded, which changes what can be processed. The grief you cannot name is often grief for your own lost presence. You realize how many years you lived partially absent, managing, performing, scanning for danger, staying useful, staying small. You remember moments you should have enjoyed, and you feel a hollow space where joy could have been. This does not mean you failed. It means you adapted, and adaptation is not free. Another fantasy is the clean reset, the dramatic new life, the instant transformation that makes the past irrelevant. And the partial answer is that you must accept a truer life. And truth can feel smaller at first because it removes the inflated stories that once distracted you. Now the grief begins to shift from pure loss into discernment. Familiarity can mimic love, and routine can mimic safety. And you confuse those mimics with true belonging when you are exhausted. Grief clarifies the difference by making nostalgia painful. Because nostalgia without accuracy becomes self-betrayal. You begin to sense that you are not grieving the whole past. You are grieving specific frequencies of it. That distinction matters, yet it does not resolve the pain, it simply sharpens the map. With a sharper map, you start recognizing what cannot be carried forward. Some relationships can evolve, some cannot. Some environments can be renegotiated, some cannot. Some identities can be refined, some must dissolve. Grief becomes the companion of that sorting process. Because sorting is loss even when it is correct. You might tell yourself you are being dramatic, but the body does not call it drama. The body calls it release. An unspoken objection appears, asking if you are becoming cold or detached. While discernment is what you are learning, and learning looks like detachment, only to those who relied on your previous confusion. The more you allow the sorting, the more you see the central wound. The life you cannot go back to is the life where you could abandon yourself without noticing. It was not that the circumstances were perfect. It was that you could tolerate internal contradiction without feeling it as pain. Awakening removed that tolerance, which is why the grief feels inevitable. You lost a capacity to self-desert, because self-desert used to be how you stayed connected to others. Now you are learning connection without self-desert, and that learning is unfamiliar, therefore threatening, therefore heavy. At this point, stabilization becomes possible, but it cannot be premature. It softens when you stop bargaining with return and start building forward. Building forward does not mean a dramatic reinvention. It means a series of small loyalties to your own signal. It means telling the truth in low-stakes moments. It means choosing alignment even when nobody claps. Each of these choices reduces internal contradiction, and contradiction is what grief sharpens into pain. Yet even as this building begins, the grief leaves something unresolved. On purpose. You do not get the past back, and you do not get a guarantee that the future will compensate you. You only get a new relationship with reality, one where your body and mind stop living in separate worlds, marking where you stopped consenting to your own disappearance. And if the grief still rises sometimes, it does not mean you are failing. It means you are still human, still remembering the cost, still refusing to pay it again. Grief does not finish its work when you understand it. Understanding only loosens the outer layer. What follows is a deeper pressure, quieter but heavier because it moves from memory into choice. You realize that the life you cannot return to is not only behind you, it still exists around you in subtle forms. Old expectations linger, old roles remain available, old habits still offer themselves as relief. And each time you almost step back into them, grief tightens not to punish you, but to stop you from crossing a line your awareness has already withdrawn consent from. This is where grief stops feeling like loss and starts feeling like responsibility. Responsibility does not arrive with confidence. It arrives with weight. You feel the weight of having fewer excuses, fewer illusions, fewer places to hide. Before you could say you did not know better. Now you know what costs you. Knowing changes the ethical structure of your inner world. You cannot unknow the difference between comfort and coherence, and grief sits in the space between them, refusing to let comfort impersonate safety again. Many people expect grief to fade as life improves. But this grief does not track improvement, it tracks alignment. You might gain clarity, stability, even moments of joy, and still feel grief surface unexpectedly. This confuses the mind, because the mind expects progress to be cumulative and linear. But grief in awakening is not about returning to baseline happiness. It is about dissolving internal contracts that were signed under fear. Contracts dissolve unevenly. Some clauses cling longer than others. Each time one releases, grief flares briefly, because release is still loss even when it is correct. You may notice that grief intensifies when you approach decisions that would have been automatic before. Choices about work, relationships, boundaries, time, energy. What used to be obvious now feels charged, because every choice now carries the question of self-loyalty. That question did not exist before, at least not consciously. You acted, adapted, endured, and moved on. Now you feel the consequence of each direction before you take it, and that anticipation creates heaviness. The unspoken objection arises, asking whether this means life must now be lived cautiously. The partial answer is that caution is not the point. Congruence is, and congruence requires pause. Grief also sharpens your perception of what is false. Not dramatic lies, but small distortions. Polite agreements, half-truths, emotional smoothing. You feel the drain immediately, where before it was delayed or invisible. This makes social life more complex because complexity replaces autopilot. You may pull back not because you dislike people, but because you can no longer afford constant self-translation. Grief accompanies this withdrawal, because withdrawal feels like loss even when it is protective. The mind objects again, worrying about isolation, and the answer remains incomplete. Because discernment always feels lonely before it finds resonance, another layer emerges here. The grief of seeing others stay where you cannot. You do not judge them, yet you feel the distance widen. You may wish you could unsee what you now see, just to feel close again. That wish carries sadness because it reveals love that cannot be expressed through sameness anymore. You are learning a different form of connection, one that does not rely on shared blindness. But learning requires time, and time without familiarity feels empty. Grief fills that emptiness until something new grows. At this stage, many people try to force meaning onto grief, to convert it into wisdom quickly. They speak about lessons, gifts, growth. These are not wrong, but when they arrive too early, they bypass the body. The body still needs to feel what was lost because what was lost shaped it. You cannot rewire without acknowledging the old wiring. Grief is that acknowledgement. It is slow because biology is slow. Neurons do not reorganize on command. Muscles do not release memory instantly. Grief gives the system time to update without fracturing. You may also notice grief appearing as fatigue rather than sadness. A deep tiredness that rest does not immediately fix. This fatigue is not depletion, it is load. You are carrying more truth than before, and truth has mass. The old life was lighter because it was hollow in places. Now you are more solid, and solidity demands strength. Strength is built gradually, through repeated contact, not through avoidance. Grief slows you down so your structure can catch up with your awareness. The unspoken objection asks why this must take so long. And the partial answer is that rushing solidity creates brittleness, and brittleness breaks under pressure. As grief continues, you begin to see that it is also protecting something. It protects you from romanticizing the past. It protects you from selling your future for familiar comfort. Each time you consider returning to an old pattern, grief reminds you why you left, not through logic, but through sensation. Sensation is harder to argue with than thought. You can debate an idea, but you cannot debate a nervous system response without consequences. Grief enforces memory at the level that matters. Eventually, grief stops dominating the foreground and becomes a background current. It does not vanish, but it no longer overwhelms. You recognize it as a signal rather than an emergency. This shift is subtle, and many people miss it because they expect closure. Closure is a story concept. Integration is a bodily process. Integration feels quieter, less dramatic, almost anticlimactic. You realize you're living differently without announcing it. You say no more easily. You leave earlier. You rest sooner. You stop explaining as much. Grief recedes not because it was conquered, but because its information has been incorporated. Yet even here, something remains unresolved, deliberately. You do not receive confirmation that the new life will be easier. You do not receive proof that alignment will be rewarded. You only receive internal consistency. That consistency feels steady, not euphoric. It allows you to inhabit your days without splitting, without constant internal negotiation. And when grief rises again, as it sometimes will, it does not destabilize you the same way. It feels like weather passing through a landscape that can hold it. The life you cannot go back to becomes less of a ghost and more of a reference point. It marks the moment you stopped confusing endurance with virtue and familiarity with safety. You do not hate that life. You respect it for getting you here. But you no longer try to resurrect it, because resurrection would require self-abandonment, and that option has quietly closed. Grief stands guard over that closure, not as punishment, but as protection. So if grief still visits you, do not rush to heal it away. Ask instead what line it is protecting. Ask what choice it is reminding you of. Ask where you are tempted to trade coherence for comfort. Grief will not answer in words, it will answer by tightening or softening. And if you learn to listen at that level, you will find that grief is not the opposite of growth. It is the cost of staying honest once honesty becomes irreversible.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.